Hi, and welcome to Infertility Unfiltered, where fertility experts and warriors are joining forces to provide you with tips, tricks, information, and inspiration, and all of the things so that you can take back control of your life and get your baby on board. Hi, I'm Jennifer Robertson, and today we are blessed to be joined by Terri Swan. Now, Terri is a womb doula, and she's also the founder of Womb Cocoon, which is a groundbreaking healing program for women suffering from womb wounds caused by trauma from abortion, miscarriage, and stillbirth, merging the complementary modalities of the grief recovery method and Orosoma. Terri works with women who are ready to release their womb's negative energy and undergo the metamorphosis of conscious womb healing. And today we're going to talk about all of the things around that, plus how you can heal from miscarriage and stillbirth. So thank you so much for joining us, Terri Swan.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be with you.
Now, let's talk womb wounds, because it's not a concept that I had ever heard of before we had connected. So tell us about a womb wound. What is it?
Well, I classify a womb as any undigested emotional material that is connected to a woman's womb.
Okay.
So oftentimes when we have a loss, we are focused on the cause of the loss, but not the emotional impact that the loss has had on us. And so a womb wound is this digested emotional material that we really have to process in order to move forward.
And so what can cause it?
So a womb wound could be caused by several different things. It could be caused by infertility, rounds and rounds of IVF. It could be caused by a stillbirth. It could be caused by a miscarriage, an abortion. It could even be caused by a sexual assault.
Okay.
Because it's anything that's connected to our womb.
Yeah, and our womb really is the central place, isn't it? It's our central hub as a woman.
It is. It's the place where we give birth to everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, for someone who may not know whether they're suffering from a womb wound, can you talk about, some of the symptoms?
Sure. So oftentimes when we've got this undigested emotional material, because of the way that we've been raised or what society has told us. So I talk about familial patterns or societal patterns have taught us that there's these certain myths around grief that we should, I'm just going to talk about one of them, which is, that time will heal our loss. And the analogy that I like to give is that if our car got a flat tire today, neither you or I, Jen, would pull up a stool beside the car and sit down and just say, well, we're just going to give this tire some time. That is not going to get the tire full of air again, nor is it going to get us moving. We actually have to take action, and we have to move through the actions to get moving again. And the same thing is true with grief in connection to our womb wounds. We have to do something to process that loss. And oftentimes society or family, one of the myths that we talk about in grief recovery is just give it time. And time does not heal a broken heart. When we are suffering from a broken heart because we've had a loss that's connected to our womb, time is not going to heal that. We need to do something to take action to move us through that process. Does that make sense?
Oh, perfect sense. I love that analogy. That's amazing. Yeah, I've never heard it like that before. That's really helpful. And so if we don't take action, and we're going to talk about what kind of action we can take in a minute, but
Sure.
If we don't take action, what will we see? Like what will happen? Like what will kind of come out?
Sure. So we might be suffering from bouts of anger because that's all undigested emotional material and it has to go somewhere. We might then, we go into addictions. We might be overeating, over shopping, over anything, overindulging. And so we start to numb because we have these uncomfortable feelings. We don't know what to do with them. And so we try to sort of tamper them down and numb them to make ourselves feel better. But it's still not moving the emotional material. It's just numbing the loss, right? We might, we might feel like we don't want to have sex with our partner, or we might feel distant from our partner because we haven't processed still what's happened there. And that feels like an intimate space for us. We don't want to let somebody into something that hasn't been processed yet. We might be feeling depressed or anxious. We might be feeling a lack of aliveness and just feeling really tired. This is really the grief process. We consider grief in grief recovery, which is really a change in a familiar pattern of behavior. And that's what grief is. We've had a loss, and now there's been this change of behavior, and we haven't been able to process it. So we're left with all of those uncomfortable feelings.
Could it also be a physiological response as well? So your period. So if you experience a miscarriage or something like that, and then your period was regular beforehand and now it's not, or even unexplained infertility, could that be something related to it as well?
Absolutely, because all of these things are connected emotionally to what we're going through. So, oftentimes I've heard of women when they're going through an emotional turmoil, or they've had a loss, they'll lose their period for a period of time. Or if they're under extreme anxiety or stress, it's very common for women to, have their period stops for a period of time. So that can also be common. It's just, once again, going back to not having processed that material, and it's, it shows up in physical ailments for sure.
Absolutely. Okay.
It can also, sorry, I just wanted to also say, it could also show up with like, for me, I'm only speaking from experience, but when I went through my losses, that's how I came to this work. I started to have lung problems. And so the apartment that I was living in, I would come home from work every day, and I was having early onset asthma. And the doctor at the time couldn't figure out. She said, "This is really bizarre. I don't understand how at 26 years of age, you now just all of a sudden have asthma." But grief oftentimes will manifest in our lungs. And so it's the site in the body where we can manifest grief. And so when I found that out years later, it made so much sense to me as to why, I had had this onset of asthma.
Wow. That's
so
amazing.
Yeah, that's just, yeah, it is amazing. So we can manifest in our body, sort of what's going on in our psyche, what's going on in our mind.
Okay, so now that we know what it is, we know what the symptoms are and what it's caused by, how do we heal from it? How do we move through it? Can you talk us through the grief recovery method and also Orasoma?
Sure can. And that's such a great question. So the grief recovery method has been around for over 40 years, and it was started by a man by the name of John James, who lost his infant son very shortly after his birth. And John found out that there wasn't really anything to help him process the grief. And so what he did was he created his own process, and it became so popular that he ended up closing down his business and doing grief recovery full time to help other grievers. And so what grief recovery is it's not counseling, but it's an educational framework that teaches people, and specifically I work with women, how to process loss. And so because I work in the niche of miscarriage, abortion, infertility, stillbirth, I am then taking women through the process of how to process loss. Now, that can apply to any loss. It could apply to, once you've learned that tool, then you have the tool to apply to, pet loss, divorce, if one of your family members passes away. Because the thing that we will experience as humans, Jen, is that we're all going to experience loss. And So the hope here is to be able to teach the process and give people that framework so that they can move through loss. This doesn't take the grief away. What it does is it gives you what we call emotional completeness.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's often the term as used around closure when we have grief or we have something that we've lost. I don't believe that if you've lost a child or if you lost anything that's of true to your heart, that you're going to get closure around that. You're not going to ever feel closure. But what you can get is you can get emotional completeness. And completeness is really when we have all of those emotional communications that we didn't get to say or have because of the loss. And they fall into really 6 categories. So when we have, when we wanted a different or a better or more out of the relationship, or we had hopes, dreams, and expectations that didn't get fulfilled. And so especially when you're dealing with, let's say, a miscarriage, a woman has miscarried and she had all these hopes and dreams and expectations of what, the pregnancy was going to be like, motherhood was going to be like, all the hopes and dreams that she had for her child, maybe, baby's first steps, first day of kindergarten, right down to walking, seeing her at her wedding or whatever that is. And so that is the completeness that we don't get. And so what grief recovery does is it brings an emotional completeness and allows the client that I'm working with to get the emotional communications out through that process and come to some sort of a completeness so that they can move their life forward.
Yeah, I love that concept. And I just want to make a note as well. In terms of grief, I think we associated it with the loss of someone or a physical thing. Whereas you just said before, grief can be grieving the idea of something. And I think a lot of us on our fertility journey as well, we had that picture in our head of how things were supposed to turn out. And it's taking longer and we're going through physical loss and we're going through all of these things. That is grief as well. And I think that that's really important to be. It doesn't have to be that you physically lose something. It could just be an ideal. And I also love that, the emotional completeness. I think a lot of us, when you talk about grief and it is closure, we don't want to close that door on the loss of a child or something like that. And I think perhaps that is something that stops us from going through the grief process because we don't want closure. But I love that idea of emotional completeness. That is something that sits better rather than I'm just going to close that door and keep on walking, because it's just not possible. And you don't want to do that, and you shouldn't have to do that.
No, and in grief recovery, we talk about closure being a period and emotional completeness being a semicolon. So there's you can have those communications to move your life forward and move your heart forward. Because the truth is that, loss is dealing with a broken heart many times. And, another thing about grief and loss is that oftentimes people say things to us and they mean to be, to express something in a meaningful way, but they're intellectualizing something that's an emotional journey for us. So they might say something like, oh, well, don't worry, you can try again, or you'll have another child. Those are all intellectual concepts, and it's our heart that's breaking. So we need someone to speak to the emotional side of what's happening for us. Does that make sense?
Perfect sense.
Yeah.
Absolutely perfect sense. And we don't know how to deal with emotional side of things. I think that's something that we do really lack, is the emotional intelligence to be able to sympathize and say things that are helpful. And I think it's, as you said, like, we just want to help people. So we just want to fix them and make ourselves feel comfortable when we're talking to them. So I think that's really important. So are there some things that you can share with us as part, like some things, like a couple of little tangible things that people who are going through grief right now can do to get that ball rolling, or a couple of little techniques that you can share with us?
Well, the number one thing that I would suggest is to order the Grief Recovery Handbook. It's such a, I mean, it's been out for, over, I think, 25 years. The book has helped millions and millions of people move through the process of loss. So that's something, it's a very easy read. It's not a complicated read, and it speaks to people's hearts. So I think that's been the connection point, and why it's been such a well-loved book, is that people really resonate with the message of it. They see themselves in so many of the situations in the book, and say, oh, I can identify, because either I've been at a funeral and oops, may have said the wrong thing that I thought was well-meaning, or I've been on the receiving end of somebody saying to me, I know how you feel. And the truth is, nobody knows how we feel. Only we know how we feel, right? And so that would be my first suggestion, would be, to pick up the Grief Recovery Handbook and try giving it a read. Another thing too is that I think is helpful is to start, and it's outlined in the book too, is to start to identify, what are some of the myths societally and from our family that we've fallen into. And oftentimes we will grieve like we were taught to grieve. And I'm going to give you a perfect example of that. When we first went through grief recovery many, many moons ago, and was just doing one of the exercises, I realized that one of the myths was replace the loss. And that had been one of the myths that I was taught. And it was something that my dad taught me, that once again was trying to be well-meaning. My cat had been killed by a car, and my dad said, don't worry, when I was crying. He was trying to calm me down. Don't worry, we'll get you a dog. So what the messaging that he was giving me is, don't worry, we're going to replace the loss. And so oftentimes you'll see this, is that, a man will lose his wife, and within a year, he will get into another relationship straight away. Mm-hmm. Because he's been taught to replace the loss.
Same when you fall pregnant and you have a miscarriage, you just you don't want to move through the grief. Like I need to fall pregnant now, because there is this hole inside of you and you want to replace it. So I 100% agree with that.
So these are some of the different messaging that we've been given, and this is how our belief system starts to form. And then we take this into our adult life. We have a loss, and we don't know how to sort through it, because either we're replacing the loss, and it doesn't work to replace a loss. You can never replace what you've lost, So that's just one of the myths, and something to consider, and to consider about how our belief systems around the decisions that we're making. I would also recommend for anybody who is gone through a loss and wanting to move that, to find some sort of a way, emotional freedom technique, or here in my practice, I'm able to use color and light to open up any blockages in the womb that might be being held with a pen that I use that's like a color and light pen. So, but for your folks that are in Australia, I would suggest doing things that can keep the energy moving. For example, breath work is an excellent way to move energy through the body. And these things are free. You can go on to YouTube and look up Wim Hof, who teaches, he's the Iceman. He teaches about breath work.
Yes, I take a cold shower every single morning, thanks to him.
So the benefits are amazing, but just even using the breath to start to move some of these things oftentimes can be so helpful, because they can get trapped in our bodies, I'm a big proponent of grief recovery because it's worked so well for my life. And that's how I came to the work, is because I needed to recover from my own grief. And then I decided I wanted to help other grievers. But there are, definitely the grief recovery method, the book, and then using different energy techniques to start the process of getting your body to move that grief. If you, at the end, I think we'll talk about, how to to hop over, rather, there is a little technique that I use called the Shakeoff, which teaches people how to shake the energy off. And if you've ever seen two ducks in the park, you know, get into it, they will often shake off the energy. Two dogs, when they get into a fight, will shake off the energy. They know that intuitively we need to just move that energy through the body. But as humans, we like to hang on. You know, it becomes like almost like our armor that we you know, we carry these knapsacks with these boulders of loss, and we don't need to do that. We can keep the energy moving.
Okay, are you going to show us how to do that?
I can show you how to do the Shakeoff.
Sure.
Which is so great. Yeah. So the Shakeoff is just such a simple and easy technique, but I'm going to stand up and show you. If you get into a situation where, and this can work for grief, but it can also work like if you're just a busy mom who, you know, has got a bunch of toddlers at home and you're working online and it's COVID and it's just, and you need 5 minutes. You can just start by shaking the energy off. Like using the technique to do exactly what a dog would do or a duck would do in the park and shake off the energy, and then jump up and down and literally just shake all of your limbs and shake the energy out of your body. It's a little 5-minute technique and it works miracles.
I love it. That's brilliant. Oh my goodness. Excellent. Oh, Terri, it has been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us. How can people get in contact with you?
Oh, thank you. So they can hop on over to the Womb Cocoon, so wombcocoon.ca, or they can hop on to Instagram at Womb Cocoon and, you know, DM me there or send me an email, and all of the information about if they're interested in working through grief recovery because of a loss due to a womb wound is there. And I would be honored to you know, work with any women who are wanting to process their loss.
Excellent. Any final bits of nuggets of wisdom that you can provide someone who is going through a loss right now?
Well, you know, I really like, and you brought it up earlier, John James, who created Grief Recovery. I really like his quote that we are taught how to acquire things, but not what to do when we lose them. And so I think just having the awareness and being mindful that this is something that we need to process, and that it's not, our heart's not going to mend with time, that we have to take action would be the thing that I would, you know, really like to just to say to everybody who's listening, is that it's a process. And once you learn the process, then you have it for any loss that might come up in the future, whether it be job loss or pet loss or anything that might apply.
Love it. Love it. Thank you so much for joining us, Terri.
Thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Now, if you enjoyed this interview as much as I did and found it as helpful as I have, make sure that you give it a little love, give it a like, give it, share it, subscribe to this channel, because this is just one of many amazing interviews as part of the Infertility Unfiltered series. So thanks for watching.